Let's start our look at layout by just going over the basics of how we navigate the space and what's different about layout versus modeler. So first off, obviously we've opened up layout. The first thing you'll notice about it that varies from modeler is that you have a camera and you have a light. So think of this space as more of like a sound stage where we make movies with our actors that we derive from modeler, and the set pieces and props that we also get from modeler. The other window attributes are more or less the same as what we saw in modeler. So we have the ability to change from top, bottom, orthographic views, front, back, etc., down to perspective view, with the addition of light view, camera view, and schematic view. We'll get into those in just a second, but also realize that the settings over here are more or less the same, except for, again, the targeting option, which is new, which we'll look at in just a second. Before we do any of that, though, I just want to point out that if you hit the D key on your keyboard, you'll get the display preferences just like in modeler, but they look slightly more complicated. At the very top, you have your viewport layout, just like in modeler. So we can switch over to a quad view or a split screen, which I tend to use most, something like this. This double vertical split screen is something I like to use because it gives me the ability to kind of look through the camera as I set up shots. So for example, I can take this divider, put my cursor over it, and I see this little move icon. I can just drag it over to make it smaller to give myself more working space on the perspective view. Meanwhile, I can take this and change it from a top view into a camera view. This helps me understand setting up the camera by basically giving me an eyepiece as if it were a real camera to look through the lens of that camera. So to understand what I'm talking about, it helps to have an actor or something to look at. So let's load something up. I'm going to go to my load. Under file, and say load object, not load scene, but load object, and I'm just going to choose something simple. I'll go ahead and load up, well, let's go with just something basic. Let's go with the mustard bottle. And we don't need the label, so that's fine. We'll just say no to that. There's our mustard bottle. Okay, so here's our camera. Here's our mustard bottle. And our light is in there somewhere. I'm not sure exactly where. But anyway, you can see through the camera view, I'm looking through the lens of this camera, looking at the mustard bottle. So the camera can be moved and adjusted just like any object that we saw in modeler, using the same keyboard shortcuts, T for move, Y for rotate. But in layout, when you select something like the camera or an object, you get these handles. So for example, you can see here that I've got the green for the Y axis, so you can see the color coordination, the red for the X, and the blue for the Z. So I can move this closer to the object, I can make it taller by grabbing this handle, move it more to the right. Or if you want, you can go to camera view and hold down your right mouse button and just drag and actually position the camera this way as well. So I'm holding down my right mouse button to move up and down, using my left mouse button to move left and right, and backwards and forwards. And I'm just clicking and dragging in the camera view, and this can be, kind of intuitive, like you're actually dragging the camera in real space as you look through it. So just some tips on setting up your camera. Now to rotate it, hit the Y key, and you'll notice those arrows turn into circles. So we have HP and B, stands for heading, pitch, and bank. The heading is green, and the pitch is green, and that allows you to pitch it up and down. So if you think of an airplane, pitching it upwards will ascend, pitching it downwards will descend. If you use the red handle, that is your heading, and that is like the heading of the plane. You can go left to right along the horizon. Banking the plane, will tilt those wings, and so in this case we're getting this what we call like a Dutch angle to get a little artsy there, and we can certainly bank our camera. all of these same rules apply to objects. If I select an object, I can move it with the T key with the move tool, and I've got the same handles and, so on and so forth. Also, of course, Y for rotate allows me to spin or rotate the object using those handles. Those are your basic moving parameters. On top of that, you can also scale an object in Layout. You don't have to do that in Modeler. And that gives me an excuse to talk about scale in general. And I know we already mentioned this in the Modeler exercise, but let's go to the Modify tab and just choose Size. I can scale up the object, make it larger or smaller accordingly. I cannot do that to the camera. These rules, those tools do not apply to the camera, but I'll explain why in a second. So on top of that, I can stretch and warp the object, and which is important for deformation animation. For cartoon animation, you may want to do just that. The difference between stretch and squash is that when I squash an object, it keeps it proportional in volume. So whatever I take on the X volume is taken out of the Y volume. Whereas stretch is infinite, so this is more like your real cartoon exaggeration tool. Alright, so getting back to the camera and scale. If I hit the D key for display options, I get the grid square size. And I showed you this in the Modeler exercise, but if I scale this up or down, you notice the relationship between the camera and the object changes. It looks like the object's getting smaller. In fact, it's not. The camera doesn't actually get larger or smaller, but the grid or the space can be adjusted. So as you can see now, the grid is at 34 millimeters. And now, as that changes, so does the relationship between the camera and the object. I typically tell people to try and get the camera to be more or less the size it would be in real life if this were a real actor. So, more or less the size of a human head or smaller. Whatever's comfortable for you. There's no right or wrong answer, but if the camera is massive and that you have a real huge disproportionate relationship between the two, something like this, or something where it's the other way around and the object greatly outsizes the camera, you may find it difficult to achieve what you want in the animation process. So just be aware of it, but be aware that it is controllable. And again, you can prepare yourself for this when you're setting up your objects in Modeler by making sure you're aware of the grid size in Modeler. So enough about scale and stretching and warping, but that's basically the key ingredients you need to understand when it comes to getting your objects sized appropriately. Alright, so when it comes to setting things up for your shot, you also have the ability to look through the light. Now, here's where I'm looking through the light right now, and I can move it or rotate it. But before I get into any of that, I want to point out that the bottom of your screen has some important keys that we haven't talked about. First off, current item allows you to switch between different objects, assuming that you have the objects mode selected. Right now I'm in objects mode, that means I'm selecting objects. But there's also bones, lights, and cameras. We won't get into bones in this exercise, but we will talk about lights a little bit and cameras. Lights we'll do a whole another tutorial for, but just suffice to say that lights have their own category. So if I don't click on lights, I won't actually be editing the light when I'm looking through the light view. So if I hit Y, I can rotate and I can spin that light around accordingly using the rotate tool, or I can move it by hitting the T key and moving, and I'm just clicking and dragging. Or I can go back to perspective view, find the light in the scene by using this targeting button. Remember I mentioned this is the one button that you don't see in Modeler? If you click on targeting, it actually puts the object in the middle so you can find it easier. So another little trick, if your light gets kind of away from you, or an object, or what have you, it gets thrown out into outer space somewhere, you can always come down to position here and just zero it out. Is it 0, 0, 0? And that puts it in the center of the universe, there in the middle of your grid plane. Makes it real easy to find and to adjust. So I can just take this light and position it. My grid square size is a little out of whack. I was telling people to try and get everything in sync, so I should practice what I preach. There we go. That's a little better. All right. Now, this light is movable and rotatable just like the objects and the camera. I will get into the different types of lights and how to set up lights properly on a whole nother lesson, but just that kind of covers light view and camera view, we already know. Schematic view is the last option, and I will get into this on another lesson, but basically, suffice to say, it's completely different than the other views. It has to do with creating relationships between objects and cameras and lights. And for now, I'll leave it at that. But the rest of these are all conventional views of the object. Okay, so we've talked about categories. We talked about the ability to switch between different items. So if we're in the lights, we have more than one light, we can switch between those. We can have as many cameras and as many lights and as many objects and as many modes as we want. There's no limit on any of these. And so it's important to have the ability to switch between different ones as we develop more and more complex scenes. So, since we have a whole lesson on lights, I'm going to kind of skip past that and go right to the camera. To set the camera up, you need to understand camera attributes. So I'm going to introduce you to the camera properties. So I have camera selected here. I have my only camera in the scene. And I will hit properties, or P for keyboard shortcut people. Hit P for properties. It brings up the render globals menu, and there's several tabs. It looks very confusing, very complicated and intimidating, and it can be, but I will go ahead and walk you through the most important ones. So we start off in the camera tab. First off, we can choose between different types of cameras for different types of renders. Perspective camera is all I really ask my students to use. I think it's all most students will ever need. They're very specialized cameras that allow you to do certain things for very specialized topics, but I don't think that most people would ever need that. Classic camera refers to the old school camera in Lightwave for people, I guess, doing legacy projects. They didn't want to get rid of it. Orthographic camera is a camera that only shoots in 90-degree angles and is distortion free. The advanced camera will have some slightly different setting abilities than the perspective camera, but the perspective camera has a fast render ability. It has all of the basic features we need to make shots and to make an animation, so it's really the one that I have people stick to. The real lens camera allows you to more better replicate real lens, well, real world cameras, like an SLR camera, for example. If you have a Canon or something and you are using Canon footage and you want to try and match it, if you're trying to use special effects setups that involve video footage shot with a real camera, then this might be an option for you. So I'll go ahead and just leave these for future reference, but perspective camera is what we stick with. The focal length, if you're familiar with photography, or if you've watched my lessons on photography, my video lessons, then you understand what that term means. But basically, just if you don't, just realize that it is what determines what type of lens you're using, whether it's wide angle, telephoto, standard, and we can adjust it. So for example, if I were to take the slider and go from a 24mm, which is wide angle, to something more telephoto, you'll see that it zooms in and creates a more narrow field of view, and you can see that happen here, but you can also see it happen over here as I go through this. So let me just drag it once again. You see through the camera view, you can see what happens. So it's almost like if you ever used a camcorder, having that zoom button on your camera, or maybe your cell phone has this. Thinking more along the lines of a camcorder, but maybe cell phones will get there. Alright, so resolution. Resolution is really critical. This is the kind of output that you're going to render. So there's a lot of different choices because this is a professional tool and it's designed to work in Hollywood, so there's a lot of different needs for different people. For our purposes, we're going to basically stick to one of two things, either HDTV 720 or HDTV 1080. So we refer to the second number in the equation just because that's kind of the nomenclature of the day. 720 would be the lowest high definition TV set, whereas 1080 would be kind of the standard as we move towards 2K and 4K televisions. And 4K will eventually become the new standard, at least for the time being. But 1080 is more than enough for our render abilities. In fact, 720 I think is perfectly fine for most projects and will blow up to 1080 rather nicely. So it gives you the same aspect ratio regardless. You'll have a 16:9 aspect ratio. Alright. The next category refers to samples, minimum and maximum. This has to do with anti-aliasing. And to explain that, I'm going to need to do a couple test renders, so let me do just that. I will come in and show you how to do a quick render. I'm not done with this panel, but I'll just break from it for a second and go to the Render tab for a moment, and there's a button here called Render Frame. This one's for rendering still images. So it's going to say, do you know render display is active? Do you want to turn on the image? We're going to say, yes, I do, so I can see it. And I'll just hit continue. Alright, so there is the result of my first render. This is with the sample set to 1 for minimum and maximum. Let's try now changing the maximum. Let's crank this up to 12. Let's do a render again. This one takes a little longer, so we're sacrificing time, but we get better quality. And so if you can't see the difference in quality, let me just switch between the two different versions. So this is the first one I rendered. You see the stair-stepping there? You see that? That's what we call aliasing. You see the stair-stepping, it's even more prevalent on the cap. Now let's take a look at the anti-aliased version. You see how it just went away and became smooth? Well, that's the difference between 12 steps of samples for anti-aliasing, the softening of that alias, that stair-stepping effect, versus 1. And so that is what these can do for you. The higher you go, the better the quality, but the longer the render. What's a good number to use? Again, it's just how much time do you have? You know, the higher the better. I typically tell people if they're rendering on a single core machine or just a low-level machine, go for 4. But if that doesn't look quite as good, you may want to crank that up to 7 or perhaps 12 even. All right. This render display, this output, can be good from time to time to take advantage of, just to test out the quality of your render. There are different things you can do in Lightwave to test out your render output, and this is certainly a step above the VPR view mode that we talked about in terms of the surfacing exercise. As I move in there, you can see the stair-stepping is quite good. The anti-aliasing is good in VPR mode, but you're going to get a better quality render when you actually render out the image at higher resolution. So is it necessary to do all the time? No, but if you really want to, if you have any doubts as to what it's going to look like when you make your movie, it's not a bad idea to go ahead and try that. Alright, so we've gotten this far. Last step is motion blur. Motion blur is for motion, so you have to have animation for motion blur to even show up. By default, it's off, and for a still image, it's not going to make a difference. But if we turn on the photoreal, let's just show you what this looks like. I'm going to take the blur length up to 150 to exaggerate it. So the longer the blur length, the more render time, but the more motion blur you'll get. What I'm going to do is make a short little animation. So to demonstrate this, what I'm going to need to do is to introduce the concept of keyframes in order to demonstrate this. So let me close out my render globals for just a moment. Here is my actor. I've got my little, let me just zoom out this a little bit here. I'm going to pull this back. Alright, so I've got my little mustard bottle. I'm going to create a little animation for this. So this slider at the bottom refers to your timeline. Your timeline is your frames, your seconds. Just understand that for every 30 frames, that equals 1 second of video, or 1 second of film. So if I'm putting this at 30, that's going to be from 0 to 30, that's 1 full second of time. So if you're doing the math in your head, you'll know that 120 would be 4 seconds. Okay, so let's do a 4-second animation. I'll go ahead and put this at 120, and I will do a quick spin. Actually, to make this faster, let's just make it 2 seconds. I will then create a motion or an animation with a keyframe. So I'm going to hit the Y key to rotate this. And I'm going to spin my bottle. Notice if you look at my pitch on my lower left corner, you can see I'm just past 360 degrees, so I spent 1 full rotation. Let's try 2. Like 720 there for our 2. Alright, so that's 2 spins in 2 seconds. That's pretty fast. How do we know the speed in which this is going to render? There is a preview option, so think of the VPR as a preview for your render quality. The preview option is a preview for the actual speed of your movie. So let's switch this to make preview, and we'll say the viewport we want to use for this preview is going to be the camera view. So we'll click OK. There it goes. We're looking through the camera. And this is the actual speed of the motion. So it's not that fast, but you know, it's pretty good. Alright, so we'll talk more about keyframes later, but just that was that simple. So all I did was I moved the slider from 0 to 60, and you see I got a new yellow mark, just like I have one at 0. That means that I have 2 records of position at 2 different time points, so at 0 and 2 seconds later. So that's how you create animation. That's that simple. It's that basic. Let's do it and show you what a render looks like. So we'll go back to render globals. Now I haven't adjusted any of the other panels yet, but I have turned on, as I've mentioned, the photoreal motion blur with 150% blur length. The other panel we absolutely have to look at before we do a render is the output panel. This is the most important because this tells Lightwave where to make the movie and where to save it. So the first step is to hit Save Animation, and then this is going to ask you for a name. So I'm going to go ahead and a location, of course, but I'm going to call this, I'll call this Mustard Bottle Movie. Alright, and now I'm going to save this to my desktop and hit save. And that's the name of the movie. The type is also critical. Without this, you won't have a movie. So choose QuickTime.move as your type. You're all good to go at that point. You don't need to mess with the options. Just go ahead and let it go. Click OK. And I will cover the other panels later, but this is the most important thing here. Now I hit render scene instead of render frame. Render frame renders a still frame, render scene renders a movie. So I hit render scene, and I say, do you want to set the render to the end of to 60, because that would match this 60, which is the length of my movie. And I would say yes. And say yes again, and it's off and running. So now it's going ahead and rendering my movie. It's rendering each frame as I speak. And as you see the render happen, you can see the motion blur I'm talking about. This is how we started. This is why we started doing this render to begin with is to look at the motion blur. But you see that blur effect I'm talking about? It's that artificial blur that creates the illusion of movement, that just smooths out the look ever so slightly. But I find it really can enhance the believability of your animation as well as enhance the artistry. I think especially in the cartoon world, if you think of Bugs Bunny, the Roadrunner and Coyote and some of the Warner Brothers, especially style, Tex Avery style animations from maybe your childhood, you remember there's a lot of stretching, a lot of, hyper realistic motion, and a lot of light trails. You think about, the hyperkinetic world of Warner Brothers animation, and when objects are thrown around or characters fall off cliffs or they slam up against a wall, there's typically a lot of streaks of light, or streaks of color, to that's what we call secondary animation, the trails that go behind the primary motion of what's happening on to the character or the object. But that is really emphasized through the process of motion blur in the 3D world. And I think it's critical for that. I think without motion blur, you really are missing some of the hyper, the hyper realistic attributes of animation that makes it fun, that makes it surreal, that makes it special. And so when people ask me, do I need motion blur? Because as you can see, it's taking quite a while. It's telling me what each 3 seconds, 2.5 seconds, So it's not the end of the world, but it's a little slower than it was when I was just doing it without the motion blur, as you saw earlier. And so people ask me, do I really need it? Is it necessary? And I say, well, of course, you don't have to do anything, but it just looks way better. You notice here, it's already taken me almost 3 minutes to do this, and I've got another 40 seconds left, but I think it's worth it. I think that, for most final renders anyway, it definitely makes a difference. Now, as a student, you're going to be doing a lot of test renders. You're going to be doing a lot of renders that do not need the glitz and the glamour of high anti-aliasing with high motion blur and long streaks. You don't need all that for your test renders. So you would want to wait until you finalized and done your tests, and once you're totally happy with your tests, then for your final render, then that's the time to apply all the goodies, and really embellish it with some of the extras that Lightwave can offer you. And I'll try and steer you towards, some of those goodies in the sense that, when to use them and when not to use them. But anyway, my movie's finally done, and let's take a look at the results. So here it is, and I'll just open it up in the player. And here we go. Look at that. So you can see that motion blur just gives it a little added, enhanced sense of believability as this spins through the air. The anti-aliasing also smooths that out, but it looks quite good. All right. So there's an example of motion blur. So these are the foremost panels when it comes to adjusting your camera. First, all of the creative options we had under cameras panel, and then the practical sense of outputting the the name of the file, the type. Cannot forget this. This is absolutely critical. When it comes to these other panels, we're dealing with extras in most cases. There's the ability to add some ambient lighting, global illumination with things like radiosity. Okay, these are really what I would consider the extras, the things that really embellish and give your render that extra kick, but are really time consuming, especially in the form of radiosity, which calculates bounced light and reflected light in your scene, which can really take time. I'll talk more about these terms when we get into lighting, but just suffice to say that it is expensive when it comes to time. If you have a lot of time, it can look great, but it is rather time intensive. A lot of these options here, these are kind of like master switches for, again, a lot of operations that add believability, like ray trace shadows, shadows that change every single frame, but take time. So they want to give you these, what I call master switches. It's kind of like having circuit breakers in your house, to turn off certain rooms all at once. It enables you to do a render quickly, to test something and disable some of the more advanced render features that would take more time to render, if that makes sense. So in other words, it gives you a quick and easy way to turn things on and off without going into specific panels in the lighting area or whatnot to go ahead and make those adjustments. It also makes them easier to switch back on when you're ready to do a final render. This basic tab here, this tells you where the first frame and the last frame of your render is going to fall, and you can add things like window burn and beeps and basic stuff. So that's kind of an quick overview of render globals. Again, the most important is the cameras tab, followed by the output, which of course is critical for the naming. The others are really embellishments to that. Now, the general tab is critical as well, but typically this will adjust, or at least ask you to adjust based upon whatever you set there. So if you forget it, it's usually not the end of the world as long as you're paying attention to your warning dialogues. And these others are really kind of the icing on the cake, these extra embellishments that you can turn on or off. All right, so that should give you an idea, at least for now. And on our next look at layout, we're going to get more into keyframes, adjusting keyframes, and adjusting animation in general. I just wanted you, for this first look, to have a basic understanding of how the camera works, how the windows work, how to import objects, etc. So we'll leave it there for now, and we'll see you on the next tutorial.